2307. What you're about to hear actually happened inside a quiet kit room at Pirbright Army Training Center on a wet Friday afternoon in late October. A 19-year-old recruit from Sheffield, only 5 days into his basic training, lifted a ceremonial cap from a wooden crate and refused to put it on. His instructor stood 3 feet away. His fellow recruits laughed behind him. And what he discovered, sewn inside the lining of that cap, nearly ended his career before it began. So why did he change his mind? What did a brass plate the size of a postage stamp tell him that made him stand taller the next morning than he ever had in his life? This story isn't about defiance. It's about the moment a young man learned that tradition only earns its weight when those who carry it understand its cost. Watch closely, because what he found in that cap is something most people who see a royal guard will never know exists. Now, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The late October air in Surrey had that particular English quality, grey from the moment the sun came up, never quite committing to rain, but never letting you forget it might. The kind of cold that found its way through wool and webbing and settled somewhere behind the collarbone. Pirbright Army Training Center sat in its low spread of red brick blocks and weathered parade squares, the Union flag above the headquarters building soaked through and clinging to its pole. Inside the main accommodation lines, recruits moved between bunks and corridors with the awkward precision of men still learning how to march in a hallway. It was the end of week 1, the first week of basic training for the foot guards. Boots had been issued, webbing had been issued, rifles, weapons drills, and the long mechanical rituals of foot drill had all begun. But the kit room at the end of B block had stayed closed until that Friday. The kit room was where the ceremonial side of the regiment lived, wool tunics on padded hangers, white buff leather belts coiled in cotton bags, brass fittings polished to a high mirror finish, each one tagged with a regimental number. And along the back wall, beneath a low fluorescent strip that buzzed faintly, sat a long row of wooden crates. The crates were unmarked. They were heavier than they looked. And inside each one, wrapped in tissue paper and laid carefully on a bed of cedar shavings, was a bearskin cap. Recruit Daniel Whitmore stood in the queue outside the kit room door, with his hands at his sides and his shoulders square the way he'd been taught 3 days ago. He was 19 years old. He was 5'11", lean from a childhood of cycling up Sheffield hills, with dark hair cropped close to the scalp and the pale, freckled skin of a boy who'd grown up under cloudy skies. His mother had raised him alone in a 2-bedroom flat on a council estate in the south of the city. She had worked in a primary school canteen during the week and volunteered 3 Saturdays a month at a small wildlife rescue in the Peak District. She had died 2 years ago when Daniel was 17, after a long illness that had taken the color out of her face long before it took her breath. He had enlisted 6 months after the funeral. His grandmother, who lived in the same flat now and watched over him from a distance, had cried when he signed the papers. She hadn't tried to stop him. Daniel had wanted the foot guards specifically. He wasn't sure why at first. He thought it was the uniform, the cleanness of it, the order, the promise that if you stood still long enough and did the work right, you would mean something. Behind him in the queue stood Private Callum Burke. Burke was 18, from Manchester, broader across the shoulders than Daniel and louder in every way. He had been the loudest recruit in the section since the first morning of training. He was the kind of lad who treated everything serious as if it might be a prank he could ruin. He leaned forward now, close enough that Daniel could smell the rain on his collar. "You ready for the dressing up box, Whitmore?" Burke said, grinning. "They're going to make us look like a Christmas window in Harrods." Daniel didn't answer. He had learned in 5 days that Burke wanted a reaction and would settle for any reaction at all. The kit room door opened and Quartermaster Sergeant Margaret Halloway stepped out into the corridor with a clipboard tucked under one arm. She was in her early 50s, short, with iron gray hair pinned tight at the back of her head, and a face that had seen every recruit who had passed through this corridor for the last 18 years. She had been a Royal Logistic Corps quartermaster before she had taken the post at Pirbright, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had outlasted 3 different commanding officers and could find any piece of kit in the building blindfolded. She looked at the queue, ticked something on the clipboard, and gestured to the first two recruits. Whitmore, Burke. Daniel stepped forward. Burke followed half a pace behind, still grinning. The kit room was warmer than the corridor. The smell hit Daniel first, a deep mix of cedar wool, leather polish, and something else underneath it that he couldn't immediately name. Something animal, something old. The fluorescent strip above the back wall buzzed faintly. Sergeant Halloway closed the door behind them and walked to the long counter that ran the length of the room. She set the clipboard down and looked at both of them over the rim of her glasses. "Right," she said. "Today you receive your ceremonial issue. You will not wear this kit for several weeks. You will not handle it casually. You will not lay it on the floor. Today you will see it, you will sign for it, and you will learn how to carry it. Whitmore, you first?" Daniel stepped up to the counter. Halloway moved down the row of wooden crates along the back wall, stopped at one near the middle, and lifted the lid. The cedar shavings shifted. She reached inside with both hands and lifted out the bearskin cap, holding it the way a person might hold a sleeping child. She set it on a square of dark blue felt in front of Daniel and stepped back. Daniel looked at it. From a distance, in photographs, in the postcards his grandmother sometimes sent from Buckingham Palace days out, she'd never actually been on. The bearskin cap looked like a tall black cylinder, a piece of theatre, a shape from a toy soldier. Up close, it was something else entirely. It was 18 inches tall. The fur was deep, layered, black, with a slight brown undertone near the base. It wasn't smooth like he'd assumed. It moved. Each strand sat slightly apart from the next, the way real fur does when it has been brushed but not pressed. There was a slight sheen across the top where the light caught it. The chin strap was gold-colored chain, heavier than it looked. The whole cap, Daniel would later learn, weighed close to 1.5 pounds. He reached out. His fingers stopped about 3 inches from the surface. He didn't know why they stopped. He looked at his own hand, hovering in the air between his body and the cap, and felt something in his chest go strange and tight. Behind him, Burke leaned forward over the counter and let out a low whistle. "Bloody hell," Burke said. "That's a proper hat. That looks like someone shot a wolf." Halloway said nothing. She was watching Daniel. Daniel lowered his hand and touched the fur. It was warm. That was the first thing. It was warm the way a living thing is warm, even though he knew that was impossible, that it was only because the kit room was heated and the wool of the lining had absorbed that heat. His fingers sank into the fur, up to the second knuckle, and met something firm underneath, a kind of dense matted base where the hairs were rooted. He felt the individual strands move under his hand. He pulled his hand back. He pulled it back fast enough that Burke noticed and laughed. "What's the matter, Whitmore?" Burke said. Scared of a hat, Daniel didn't answer. He looked at Halloway. She was still watching him, her face unreadable, the clipboard forgotten on the counter beside her. He swallowed. He said, "Sergeant, this is real fur." He hadn't meant it to come out as a question, but it had. Halloway nodded once, slowly. "Yes, Whitmore, it is. What kind?" "Canadian black bear," the fluorescent strip buzzed. Daniel looked back down at the cap. His hand was hanging at his side now, and he didn't know what to do with it. He could feel Burke's eyes on him. He could feel Halloway's eyes on him. He could feel something else too, something rising up from a place he had thought he'd put away 2 years ago in a crematorium chapel in Sheffield with rain on the windows. "I didn't know," Daniel said. His voice came out quieter than he wanted. "I thought it was. I thought they made it from synthetic. I thought." He stopped. He looked at the cap. The black fur sat perfectly still on the blue felt, and he could see now, looking at it properly, that no machine had made this. No factory had stitched these strands one by one into a base. This had been alive. Burke made a noise that was halfway between a laugh and a scoff. "Mate," Burke said. "What did you think it was? Have you never seen a documentary?" Burke, Halloway said without looking at him. "Outside, wait in the corridor." Burke opened his mouth. "Now private." Burke went. The door closed behind him. Daniel and Halloway stood alone in the warm, cedar-smelling room with the cap on the counter between them. Halloway didn't speak straight away. She moved instead. She walked to the end of the counter, lifted a low wooden stool, carried it over, and set it down on Daniel's side of the counter. "Sit," she said. Daniel sat. He didn't want to sit. He wanted to stand at attention and pretend none of this was happening, but she had said it the way you said it to a horse that was about to bolt, and so he sat. She leaned against the counter beside him and looked at the cap. She didn't look at him. That was the kindness in it. "Take your time, Whitmore," she said. "You're not the first." He stared down at his boots. The boots had been polished last night for an hour. He could see his own face in the toe caps if he looked hard enough. He didn't look. "My mum," he said. He stopped. He hadn't meant to say it. He didn't say "my mum" to people. He hadn't said "my mum" out loud since the funeral. "Go on," Holloway said. "She did wildlife rescue," Daniel said. "Up in the peaks. She was a volunteer. Foxes mostly, sometimes birds. There was a barn owl once that had broken its wing on a fence wire, and she sat with it for 2 nights in the airing cupboard until the vet could see it." Holloway nodded. She still didn't look at him. She had this rule, Daniel said. The words were coming now whether he wanted them to or not. "She used to say it to me when I was little," she said. "Animals don't owe us anything. We owe them. We owe them dignity. We owe them not pretending they're not real." He swallowed. The fluorescent strip buzzed. "She died 2 years ago," Daniel said. "She had cancer. It took a long time. I joined up 6 months after the funeral. I wanted." He stopped. He didn't know what he wanted. He had thought he wanted to mean something. He had thought he wanted the uniform. He had thought the uniform was clean. And now there was a bear on the counter in front of him. And his mother's voice was somewhere in the back of his head, saying, "We owe them, not pretending they're not real." And he didn't know what to do with his hands. Holloway let the silence sit. She let it sit for a long time. Long enough that Daniel started to think she'd forgotten he was there. Then she pushed herself off the counter and walked to a low cupboard at the far end of the kit room. She unlocked it with a key from her belt. She came back carrying a leather-bound book about the size of a hymnal. She set it down on the counter next to the cap. "This is the regimental ledger for ceremonial caps issued from this kit room," she said. "Every cap we hold has an entry. I keep it. The quartermaster before me kept it. The quartermaster before her kept it. It goes back to 1986, when this particular set of records started." She opened the ledger. The pages inside were lined. Each line had a number, a date, a place name, and a signature. Daniel looked. He didn't understand what he was looking at. Holloway tapped one line with her finger. "This cap," she said, "the one in front of you. It was issued to this kit room in March of last year. Before that, it was held in central regimental stores for 3 years. Before that," she turned to the inside front cover of the ledger and slid out a small index card. "Before that, the pelt came from a black bear that was culled in Manitoba, Canada, in November 2019. The bear was an adult male. It was taken under the licensed annual cull that the Canadian provincial authorities run every year to manage the bear population. The Ministry of Defense purchases the pelts from that cull. It is the only source. We do not breed bears. We do not hunt bears for this purpose. We take what the cull would have produced anyway." She paused. She looked at Daniel for the first time since he'd sat down. "If we didn't buy the pelt, Whitmore, the bear would still have been culled. The pelt would have been sold to a furrier or burned. We buy it, we treat it, we turn it into this." She gestured at the cap. "And then we keep it for as long as we possibly can. The average cap in our stores is between 30 and 70 years old. Some of the ones in the Regimental Museum are over 100. We do not replace them unless they are physically destroyed. Every cap is logged, repaired, restored, and passed on." She closed the ledger. "Now," she said, "I want to show you one more thing." She picked the cap up. She held it with both hands the way she had when she'd taken it out of the crate, and she turned it slowly upside down so that the black fur was facing the felt and the inside lining was facing up. The lining was dark green, quilted, with a leather sweatband around the rim. And sewn into the back of the sweatband, just behind where the wearer's head would sit, was a small brass plate. The plate was about the size of a postage stamp. It was engraved. Holloway held the cap steady so Daniel could read it. The engraving said, "Pelt Source, Manitoba, November 2019, Eber the M." Holloway said, "Is for male. Every cap has one of these. Every cap, it's there so that the man who wears it knows. He knows what he's carrying. He knows where it came from. He knows the date. We don't hide it under a label. We don't put it somewhere you'd never look." We put it where the wearer's head will rest against it for every parade he ever stands, so that he can never forget. Daniel looked at the brass plate. He looked at the date. November 2019. He had been 14 years old in November 2019. His mother had been alive. He had been doing his GCSE mocks. Somewhere in Manitoba, a black bear had been walking through pine woods in the first snow of the winter. He felt the strange tight feeling in his chest again, but it was different now. It wasn't the same feeling he'd had when he first touched the fur. He didn't know what it was. "Why do you do this?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. Holloway set the cap down gently on the felt, right side up. "Why do we keep the ledger, or why do we wear the cap?" "Both," she thought about it. She wasn't a woman who answered fast. "We keep the ledger because tradition only earns its weight when you can account for it. If you can't tell me where the cap came from and what it cost, then you don't deserve to wear it. As for why we wear it, that's not my answer to give you." There was a knock at the door. A short, hard, single knock. Holloway straightened. "Come in," she said. The door opened. The man who stepped into the kit room was in his late 40s. He was not tall, no more than 5'8", but he carried himself like a man who had never in his life needed to be taller than he was. He wore the working dress uniform of a color sergeant, the 4 chevrons and crown on his upper sleeve crisp against the dark green. His face was weathered the way faces get from 22 years of standing outside in every kind of weather England can produce, and from a posting to Belize in the early 2000s that had left a permanent tan along the back of his neck. His name was Eamon Doyle. He had been born in Cork to a Royal Irish Regiment family, moved to England at 6, and joined the Foot Guards at 17. He had been an instructor at Pyebright for the last 4 years. The recruits called him Sir to his face and Sergeant Doyle behind his back, and the older instructors called him Eamon, and his wife in Aldershot called him Eam, and almost no one outside those 3 groups had ever spoken his first name aloud. He looked at Holloway. Holloway gave him a small nod. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the cap on the counter. He looked at Daniel again. "Stand up, Whitmore," he said. Daniel stood. He stood the way he'd been taught to stand 5 days ago, heels together, shoulders back, eyes forward. Doyle walked slowly across the kit room until he was standing in front of the counter, an arm's length from Daniel. He looked down at the cap. He looked at the brass plate, still visible because Holloway hadn't moved it. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Daniel. "Sergeant Holloway tells me you're struggling." "Son." Daniel didn't know how to answer that. He hadn't heard Holloway say anything. Holloway had not, in fact, said anything, but Doyle had been in the corridor for the last 4 minutes. He had seen Burke walk out. He had not needed to be told. "Sergeant," Daniel said. His voice was steadier than it had been. "Permission to speak freely. Cranit. I didn't know it was real. I didn't know what it was. I had a..." He stopped. He didn't want to say my mum to a color sergeant on the 5th day of training. He said my family. We had values about animals. Doyle nodded once. He didn't interrupt. He didn't fill the silence. He waited. Daniel said, "I'm not sure I can wear this, Sergeant." The words hung in the warm, cedar-smelling air. Burke, in the corridor outside, could not have heard them. Holloway, 2 feet away, had heard them. Doyle had heard them. Doyle looked at the cap for a long moment. Then he did something Daniel didn't expect. He reached forward and picked it up. He held it the same way Holloway had, with both hands underneath. He turned it slowly so that the fur caught the fluorescent light and the deep color of it became visible all at once. He looked at it like a man looking at a face he knew. "I've been in this regiment for 22 years, Whitmore," Doyle said. He spoke quietly. He was not a man who shouted unless a drill square required it. "I've worn 5 different caps in my service. The one I wear now was first issued in 1954. The man who wore it before me retired in 2003. The man who wore it before him died in 1991, and his widow returned it to the regiment in a hat box. The man before that wore it through the Suez Crisis. The bear it came from was culled in northern Ontario in 1953. He paused. "Every man who has worn that cap has known where it came from. Every man who has worn it has signed his name in a ledger like the one Sergeant Holloway has just shown you. Every man who has worn it has felt that brass plate against the back of his head for every minute of every parade he has ever stood. We don't hide it. We don't pretend the bear didn't exist. We carry it with us. We carry it on top of our heads in the rain and the sun and the snow, and we stand still for hours at a time so that other people can look at us and remember things they otherwise wouldn't remember. He set the cap down. He looked at Daniel directly. We don't wear it because the bear was ours, son. We wear it because the bear was real. The fluorescent strip buzzed. Holloway didn't move. Daniel didn't move. Something in the warm air of the kit room had changed in a way he couldn't have explained if anyone had asked him. Doyle stepped back from the counter. He said, "I'm not going to tell you to put it on. You're a soldier in the British Army. You're not a prop. If you wear that cap, you wear it because you understand what it is. If you don't understand, you don't wear it, and we have a longer conversation about whether the Foot Guards is the right place for you." He paused. "I'll give you 20 minutes. Sergeant Holloway will stay. When I come back, you tell me your answer." He turned. He walked to the door. He opened it. He paused with his hand on the doorframe and looked back. "Whitmore, Sergeant. My mother taught me to respect living things too. I think about her every time I put it on." He went out. The door closed behind him.